Welcome back, everyone. We are in the home stretch of this epic history TV series on the Napoleonic Wars. This is Endgame, France, 1814. Napoleon has marched into Russia and lost his Grande Armée. He's built a new army and gone back in, and he's now lost the battle at Leipzig, the Battle of the Nations. Things are going south in the south, where Wellington is now going to march into France. So we are at the end game, but Napoleon's not done yet. As many of you have told me, just wait. Napoleon's going to do some crazy things, but we all know how this ends. So, as always, there are links in the description to the original content and to the beginning of this series, my reaction series to this, which is something like over a dozen videos now. So check those things out. And at the end, I'm going to be telling you about my latest video from the battlefields of Ypres. I visited a place called Poppering, which is where many of the British Expeditionary Forces military members that were executed had their trials, were held, and were buried. And I visited some of the sites associated with that. So check that out. It's called Shot at Dawn. It's my latest on-location video. I'll throw up a link at the end. Let's go ahead and dive in.
In October 1813, Napoleon had suffered his heaviest ever defeat at Leipzig, the Battle of the Nations. Surviving French forces, exhausted, sick and demoralized, retreated to the River Rhine and prepared to defend France from invasion. But in November, the armies of the Sixth Coalition paused their advance.
It's kind of interesting seeing the River Rhine being attacked from the east into the west as kind of the last stand place, right? Because this is the place where, in World War II, the Germans are going to be trying to make their stand and hold off the Allies attacking from the west.
And Austrian Foreign Minister Metternich offered peace terms. The Frankfurt proposals would allow Napoleon to keep his throne if France returned to her so-called natural frontiers.
Take it.
It was the best offer Napoleon was likely to get, now that his back was to the wall, and all Europe's great powers were united against him. Even so, he did not accept the terms. He merely agreed to reopen negotiations. To the Allies, and many in France itself, it proved that Napoleon would not listen to reason.
Yeah, you have to say that's the case at this point, right? I mean, he was a really young guy when this all starts out. He's still, late 40s? He's, 45 years old? He's my age at this point, because he was born in 1769. So he's still a young guy. He's still potentially got a lot of life in him. He's got a chance to establish himself and his descendants on the throne of France. In hindsight, this seems like a really good idea. I'm really curious to know what was going on in his mind that he wasn't willing to accept it.
The war went on, and by January 1814, Napoleon's situation looked even worse. Many of his besieged garrisons in the east were starved into surrender. Marshal Davout, with 34,000 men in Hamburg, was now besieged. Denmark, one of France's last allies, was invaded by Bernadotte's Swedish army and made to join the coalition. French troops evacuated the Netherlands, which reasserted its independence after nearly 20 years of French control. In Italy, Eugene's army faced a new enemy, Joachim Murat, King of Naples, now marching north with 30,000 men to honor his new alliance with the Sixth Coalition.
To hang on to his throne, man. That's the danger that you have in putting your friends and allies on the throne, is that at some point, if things start to turn for you, they're going to be watching out for what they've already gained and not want to lose that.
In Paris, Napoleon responded to the crisis with a series of extreme measures. Property taxes doubled, state salaries and pensions suspended, 300,000 new conscripts called up from a country already exhausted by 20 years of war.
Yeah, they're going to turn on you, dude.
He ordered the release of Pope Pius, under French house arrest for the last 5 years, to try to shore up his support in Italy. He even agreed to release Fernando, the Bourbon King of Spain, to take up his throne in exchange for peace between France and Spain, a condition that Fernando was in no position to honour. But these concessions were too little, far too late.
Yep.
In January, 2 coalition armies crossed the Rhine into France. Blücher's army of Silesia and Schwarzenberg's army of Bohemia. Outnumbered French forces in their path could only fall back. On the 25th of January, Napoleon said farewell to his wife and son at the Tuileries Palace, before leaving for the front. He would never see either of them again. With just 70,000 men, he faced odds of 4-1. Most of his troops were raw conscripts, some without uniforms, many just learning how to hold a musket.
So let's just set the stage here for a minute, right? Just kind of look at what's happening. You've got 70,000 raw recruits who've never really served, that you've just called up. You're scraping the bottom of the barrel. You've had to, increase taxes exponentially. You've cut off salaries to people. So you're probably dealing with a hostile home front. Your homeland has now been invaded. You've lost millions, literally millions of men at this point. And you're going to march out to face armies that outnumber you 4-1. What is going through your mind at that point? Especially when you've been offered opportunities to hang on to your throne to where you don't have to try and do this.
But for the first time in years, Napoleon's army was so small that he'd be able to exercise direct command over all its movements. The result would be one of the most audacious and brilliant campaigns in history.
Still confident.
The battle for France would be fought east of Paris, mostly across Champagne, a flat region divided by the rivers Marne and Seine.
So this is pretty fascinating to look at because I'm just thinking about what has gone on in this area. This is where a lot of the fighting has taken place for the Franco-Prussian War, which comes, 1870, 1871. This is where a lot of the fighting for the First World War is going to be. Like Chateau Thierry right here. This is the Battle of Belleau Wood, where the American Marines are going to make a name for themselves, is right outside of Chateau Thierry. The Aisne-Marne Cemetery is there. This is there's just so many major battles that take place here over hundreds and hundreds of years.
And their tributaries. In late January, fields were dusted with snow, and roads quickly turned to mud. Napoleon learned that the coalition armies were widely scattered, with part of Blücher's army near Napoleon's old college at Brienne. The emperor advanced rapidly, hoping to trap and destroy part of Blücher's army. But after a hard day's fighting that cost both sides 3,000 casualties, Blücher was able to retreat towards Schwarzenberg's army. That evening, Napoleon was nearly skewered by a charging Cossack, saved only by General Gorgo's good shooting. As Napoleon tried to work out the enemy's movements, Blücher, heavily reinforced by Schwarzenberg, made a surprise attack at La Rothière. Allied troops advanced through swirling snow to assault the village, defiantly held by young French conscripts.
And this is unusual. February 1st of 1814, this time in history, you're not going to see a ton of battles fought during this time. They typically talk about the campaigning season beginning in spring and going into fall. That's when you want to be moving your armies. Usually, this time of year, you're holed up somewhere. You've built like structures that are going to keep your army warm and keep them safe and try to limit disease and starvation as much as you can.
One was so inexperienced that Marshal Marmont had to personally show him how to load his musket during the battle. By late afternoon, Wreder's Bavarian corps was falling on Napoleon's flank. Heavily outnumbered, Napoleon had no option but to retreat, having lost 5,000 casualties and 73 guns abandoned in the thick mud. The Allies' frontal attacks meant their losses were greater, but by combining their armies, they defeated Napoleon on French soil for the first time. Believing Napoleon would now retreat towards Paris, the Allies decided to advance along two routes to ease pressure on the roads. Blücher would take a northern route along the Marne. Schwarzenberg would follow the Seine. But dividing their armies again would play right into Napoleon's hands.
You don't want to do that against him. Even with a conscript army. The study of it has given me a greater idea of his genius than any other. Wellington recognized it.
After 2 days to reorganize, Napoleon continued his retreat to Nogent, where he learned that the Allies had split their armies. Not only that, they were advancing at different speeds. The aggressive Blücher racing ahead, while the more cautious Schwarzenberg lagged behind. Leaving Oudinot and Victor to guard the Seine bridges and delay Schwarzenberg, Napoleon raced north through mud and rain with 30,000 men. The army of Silesia was strung out on the march,
perfect for him.
Oblivious to the danger it was in.
This is really the only way Napoleon can win this, right? I mean, he's got to do defeat in detail. He's got to take on one part at a time. All things being equal, if Napoleon and whatever opponent he's facing have equal numbers and equally trained men and equally equipped men, I think Napoleon's going to win 99 times out of 100. But he's so heavily outnumbered at this point that really he's got to look for whatever options he has. The Allies have handled this all pretty well up to this point, but now they're spreading themselves out. It seems to me like they think Napoleon is weaker than he really is.
First, Napoleon fell on General Osufiev's Russian 9th Corps at Champaubert, destroying it, taking its commander and 2,000 men prisoner. The next morning, he marched on General Osten-Sacken's force near Montmiral. This was a much larger force, with 2 infantry and 1 cavalry corps, and was expecting support from York's Prussian 1st Corps. But the Prussians were late, and Sacken's troops could not withstand the French onslaught. At this desperate hour, the Emperor's elite Old Guard were no longer held back, but were often thrown into the thick of the fighting. By the end of the day, Napoleon had inflicted another 3,500 casualties, twice his own losses, and the Allies were in rapid retreat.
And that's what he's going to have to do. He's going to have to inflict 3-to-1 casualties in every one of these battles, or he's going to run out of men long before the coalition does.
Napoleon had ordered Marshal MacDonald to cut off the enemy's escape by seizing the Marne Bridge at Chateau Thierry. But York's Prussians got there first.
If you're in the U.S. Army, in the 3rd Infantry Division, they're known as the Rock of the Marne. That's where it happened. It was at Chateau Thierry, holding the bridge crossing against the onslaught of German forces that earns the 3rd Infantry Division of the U.S. Army the nickname the Rock of the Marne, because they held when nobody else was there. So interesting to see this happening.
The next day, Napoleon could only batter their rear guard as the enemy fled across the Marne, destroying the bridge behind them. Sending Marshal Mortier to rebuild the bridge and continue the pursuit, Napoleon doubled back to rejoin Marmont, who had been left to keep watch on Blücher. Napoleon attacked at Vauchamp, using General Grouchy's cavalry to outflank Blücher's army, which was soon in headlong retreat.
So here's the one problem I'm seeing with this, and I don't know exactly how this all plays out detail by detail, but if he's the one negative to this is he's being able to take on little parts, but the whole time he's focused on Blücher and these German forces, you've got another force that's further south that's making its way toward Paris. And how long can Napoleon keep fighting these guys before he's got to go deal with them, or it's too late and they march into Paris?
A merciless French pursuit inflicted 6,000 Prussian and Russian casualties. Napoleon lost just 600 men.
That's what he needs.
Napoleon had taken on an enemy army almost twice his size and beaten it 4 times in just 6 days.
That's impressive.
Blücher had lost an estimated 15,000 casualties in battle, and another 15,000 in smaller engagements, as stragglers or deserters.
And here's one of the things I'm thinking with all of this is that when you know it's the end game, when you've now made it into Paris, and you feel like Napoleon is on his last legs, and you're obviously confident, overconfident, because you've divided your army to try and march on Paris itself, you've got to be thinking Napoleon's done. And so they're probably hurling their men at his army, thinking, this is the charge, this is the attack that's going to break him once and for all, and this is going to be done. So I'm thinking there's probably some of that mindset going on with Blücher.
For now, the army of Silesia had been scattered and neutralized. But in the south, Marshals Victor and Oudinot had not been able to prevent Schwarzenberg's army of Bohemia from crossing the Seine in 3 places. Austrian troops were now just 40 miles from Paris. Leaving Mortier and Marmont to keep watch on Blücher, Napoleon raced south. Schwarzenberg, alarmed by news of Blücher's defeat and of Napoleon's approach, immediately ordered a retreat. It was too late for Wittgenstein's advance guard, routed at Mormain with 2,000 casualties. Napoleon sent Victor's Second Corps to seize the bridge at Montereau, but was so infuriated by its slow progress that he sacked Victor and gave his corps to General Gérard. The next day, at the Battle of Montereau, the French drove the Allied Württemberg Corps back across the river, with 30% losses. According to some accounts, the Emperor sighted the French cannon himself, as he had at Lodi 18 years before. Napoleon had the Allies on the run. But how long could it last?
Recollect what your military position is. If we act with military and political prudence, how can France resist a just peace demanded by 600,000 warriors? Let her if she dare. Castlereagh and Metternich are going to be 2 of the key architects of the Congress of Vienna, which is going to decide. It's, in a lot of ways, kind of what happens with some of the meetings that are going on late in World War II, where they're deciding what post-war Europe is going to look like. That's what's happening in the Congress of Vienna as well. As
fighting continued, negotiations between France and the coalition reopened at Châtillon-sur-Seine on the 5th of February. The Allied terms were now more severe. A return to France's frontiers of 1791, which meant the additional loss of Belgium, a humiliation that Napoleon refused to accept. Instead, he tried to revive the Frankfurt proposals, hoping to play for time and to split the coalition, whose war aims varied from Britain's hard line to Austria's more ambiguous position. But this hope was thwarted by British Foreign Secretary Lord Castlereagh. On the 1st of March, he persuaded the Allies to sign the Treaty of Chaumont. In it, Russia, Prussia, Austria and Great Britain agreed to keep 150,000 troops in the field, and not to negotiate separately with France.
That second one is huge, and the same thing is going to happen again in World War I, where the Allies are going to make a decision early on that they will not have separate negotiated pieces. And you'll see why when Russia drops out of the war because of their revolution, how that opens up the Western Front for the Germans. And the Germans don't have that same kind of agreement in place with the Central Powers, and so you'll have a situation where the Ottoman Empire and the Austrian Empire, Austro-Hungarian Empire, are going to drop out of the war, leaving Germany to fight by themselves. This is huge for them to come to this agreement.
While Britain added the sweetener of a £5 million subsidy to be shared among the Allies.
Just throwing that money around.
The treaty's secret articles specified common war aims, including the future independence of the German states, Switzerland and Italy, while Spain was to be returned to the Bourbons and Holland to the House of Orange.
And a lot of these are going to become kind of the starting points for the Congress of Vienna. It gives them kind of a place to build on their negotiations.
The four powers even agreed that once they'd defeated Napoleon, they'd form a 20-year defensive alliance to maintain peace in Europe, a sign of their newfound commitment to each other. A split in the coalition had been Napoleon's last, best hope for a favourable peace. That was gone. And news from across the country was bleak. French cities were surrendering to the Allies without a fight. Nancy, Dijon and Mâcon had all fallen. In the south, Wellington defeated Marshal Soult at Orthez, forcing him to fall back on Toulouse. 2 weeks later, as British troops approached the city of Bordeaux, it declared loyalty to France's Bourbon kings. The mayor himself rode out to greet the British, bearing a white cockade, the sign of Bourbon allegiance.
And this is the last straw for Napoleon. I mean, if you're now losing the home front, you're done. You're really just done. Victories in the field at this point start to become meaningless.
Napoleon's hope for a nation in arms to resist the Allies had not materialized. Allied troops, particularly Cossacks, often robbed French civilians and committed some atrocities. French peasants took revenge when they could, but there was no guerrilla war to mirror what French troops had encountered in Spain or Russia. The chief desire among ordinary French people was for peace, at almost any price.
So even though you have the French foreign minister here now, dangers crowded upon him, encompassed him, oppressed him from every side, but he sought to escape from them by misrepresenting them to himself. In other words, what you have the foreign minister saying is Napoleon at this point is delusional about the situation. He has convinced himself that there's something to be gained here that isn't, and that's what you're going to end up seeing, is that his own people, his own marshals, his own government is going to have to tell him it's done, you have to step down.
Any talk of Napoleon's defeat in late February was premature. The French Emperor was driving Schwarzenberg's army of Bohemia before him, even though it was twice his size. But Schwarzenberg scrambled to safety behind the River Aube. Napoleon knew he had to land another decisive blow soon, so turned his attention back to Blücher. After an aborted attempt to join forces with Schwarzenberg, Blücher had decided to resume his advance on Paris, gathering reinforcements en route, and with only Marmont and Mortier's weak corps to oppose him. Leaving Marshal MacDonald in command in the south, Napoleon set off to intercept Blücher, covering 60 miles in 3 days along terrible roads choked with mud.
Impressive. And see, to me, that tells me that his men aren't quite done yet. If they're covering 60 miles in 3 days on bad roads to go into another battle after they've been fighting, tells me their morale, or at least their belief in Napoleon, hasn't waned completely.
At Napoleon's approach, Blücher retreated across the Marne, burning the bridges behind him. 24 hours later, they'd been rebuilt by French engineers, and Napoleon was poised to crush Blücher against the Aisne River, because the major crossing point at Soissons was held by a Franco-Polish garrison. But after just a day's fighting, the garrison commander at Soissons tamely surrendered, allowing Blücher to escape.
Napoleon can't be everywhere.
Napoleon continued his pursuit across the Aisne, still hoping to cut off the army of Silesia. But at Craon, he encountered Russian troops in a strong defensive position. The Russians fought stubbornly. The French finally forced the enemy to withdraw, but only at the cost of 6,000 casualties, including many irreplaceable veterans from Napoleon's guard.
One thing I'm curious about, and I would love to hear from some of our European followers, some of you who live in some of these places where these battles were fought, whether that's in France or Germany or Russia or Poland or any of them, Austria, were they all just buried in mass graves that are unmarked today? Or do we actually have cemeteries where some of these men were buried? I'm curious to know. Let me know in the comment section. Like, is there a place you can go and see the graves of men who fought in these battles anywhere?
Napoleon pushed on to Laon. But by now, Blücher had concentrated his forces, 98,000 troops in all, and outnumbered Napoleon 2-1. French attacks were repulsed, while Marmont's corps was caught off guard by a late Allied counterattack and routed. Napoleon was lucky to avoid a much heavier defeat. Blücher, usually aggressive to the point of recklessness, was unwell and had been told Napoleon's army was twice as big as it was, leading him to act with unusual caution.
All right, McClellan.
Laon was a heavy blow to Napoleon. 6,500 casualties he could not afford.
Nah, he can't take that.
Undaunted, he fell back to Soissons, and after a brief moment to reorganize, he marched on the city of Reims, which had just fallen to Saint-Priest's Russian corps.
So again, talking about future history to come, this is where the surrender is going to happen, where the Germans are going to surrender to the Western Allies. And to the Russians, so really all the European allies. There'll be two surrenders, one here and one on the Eastern Front, but this is where the Western Front surrender will take place at the end of World War II.
In a whirlwind assault, Napoleon retook the city. Saint-Priest himself was mortally wounded, his corps routed. Meanwhile, in the south, Schwarzenberg had resumed his offensive as soon as he found out Napoleon had gone north. In heavy fighting, he'd driven Oudinot and MacDonald back from the River Aube. 5 days later, the Allies had recaptured Troyes, as MacDonald retreated behind the River Seine. Now, after 4 days to rest and reorganize his battered army, Napoleon was coming south once more.
Bouncing back and forth.
Schwarzenberg, emboldened by news of Napoleon's defeat at Laon, decided that this time he would stand and fight.
The amount of communication that has to be going on between Napoleon and his various corps commanders during this whole the Napoleonic Wars is just impressive, because I keep seeing these movements back and forth and all this coordination. It's really quite something. In the early decades of the 19th century, to be able to communicate and move like this.
Napoleon advanced on Arcis-sur-Aube, ignoring reports that the enemy was not retreating as he believed, but gathering for battle. As heavy fighting broke out, Napoleon still believed he faced only the enemy rearguard. It was a nasty surprise to discover that he faced the entire might of the army of Bohemia. 28,000 men against 80,000. In desperate fighting, Napoleon personally rallied fleeing troops and exposed himself to enemy fire, having his horse killed under him by an exploding shell.
Now, I wonder if at some point, and I think I remember something to the effect of this happening at some point, Napoleon is going to have a moment of clarity where he's going to realize this is all lost, and he might think to himself, well, you know what, if I'm going to lose, I'm going to go out in a blaze of glory, right? I'm going to die on the battlefield. I'm sure that had to have crossed his mind at some point.
But the odds were too great. At the end of the second day, Napoleon was forced to order the retreat.
Oh, there you go. Saw the glorious death disputing foot by foot the soil of the country. The balls flew around me, my clothes were pierced, but none reached me. There it is.
Napoleon believed his army was now too weak to take on the Allies directly, so he decided to change strategy. He would march into the rear of the Allied armies, join up with some of his isolated garrisons, and cut the enemy's lines of communication, forcing them to abandon their advance on Paris.
More desperate, all the time.
But the Allies, until now always one step behind Napoleon, had just received crucial information. Talleyrand, the most brilliant French diplomat of the age, and the most slippery.
Yeah.
He'd served France's monarchy, the Revolution, then Napoleon, until in 1807 he fell out irrevocably with the Emperor over foreign policy.
Talleyrand is a guy who first and foremost is going to go wherever the wind's blowing, right? He's a smart guy, he's a shrewd guy, but he also is a guy who puts Talleyrand first, or at least puts what he thinks is best for France first, rather than who he's serving at any given time.
He now believed that Napoleon was dragging France into ruin, and worked behind the scenes to ensure his downfall. From Paris, he wrote to the Russian Emperor Alexander at Allied headquarters, informing him that in the capital, support for Napoleon was crumbling, and the city's defences had been completely neglected. He urged the Allies to march immediately on Paris, without allowing Napoleon to distract them.
Now, if you're the Allies, do you believe this, or do you question whether this is some kind of ruse to draw you into destruction?
Talleyrand's information was confirmed when the Allies intercepted a report from Napoleon's chief of police, General Savary, meant for the Emperor.
Oh, okay.
The treasury, arsenals and powder stores are empty. We are completely at the end of our resources. The population is discouraged and discontented, wishing peace at any price. As Napoleon advanced on Saint-Dizier, the Allies sent General Witzengerode and 10,000 cavalry to harass his army and to screen their own movements. Then began their march on Paris. At Fère-Champenoise, they collided with Marmont and Mortier's corps, advancing to join Napoleon. An entire National Guard division, 5,000 men, was virtually wiped out as the marshals suffered a crushing defeat.
So now it's Napoleon's men who are being defeated in detail, isolated and destroyed apart from the main army.
Napoleon feared that the fall of Paris would be a fatal blow to his regime. His political authority and ability to wage war might not recover. So when he received news of the Allies' movements, he tore up his plans and ordered a forced march back to Paris, intending to lead its defense in person. Napoleon's wife and son were evacuated from the capital, along with most of his ministers. His brother, Joseph, the ex-king of Spain, was in charge of the city's defences, but had done little. Paris was awash with rumours of treachery and defeat. Marmont and Mortier were able to reach Paris before the Allies, adding their troops to the garrison. It now totaled 37,000 men, including some hardened veterans of the Guard, but many more young conscripts, while a third were part-time soldiers of the National Guard. The Allies had 120,000 seasoned troops outside the city, and given the urgency of taking Paris before Napoleon could intervene, their elite guards and grenadier divisions would lead the way. On the 30th of March, they began their assault from the north. Heavy fighting raged throughout the day. The city's defenders fought bravely, inflicting several thousand casualties on the advancing enemy. But defeat was inevitable.
Yeah, I mean, you're outnumbered 3-4 to 1. You're out experienced by these soldiers. You've got a populace that's discontent and worried about themselves. It's a no-win situation.
That night, to save Paris from destruction, Marshal Marmont agreed to surrender the city, on condition the garrison was permitted to leave with its weapons. At the Hôtel des Invalides, the 71-year-old Marshal Serrurier oversaw the burning of 1,400 flags and standards captured from France's enemies, as well as Frederick the Great's sword and sash, so they would not fall into Allied hands.
What an incredible historical treasure trove that is, if they had been kept.
Napoleon was just 15 miles from Paris when he was informed of the city's surrender. He sat with his head in his hands for 15 minutes.
We do not intend to expose Paris to the fate of Moscow. Well, I mean, to be fair, it was Moscow's own people who destroyed that city, so...
On the 31st of March 1814, France's enemies marched into Paris for the first time since the 100 Years' War. Parisian crowds cheered the three Allied monarchs, bringers of peace. Everyone in Paris was suddenly a royalist once more. Above all, they cheered for Emperor Alexander of Russia, now hailed as Europe's saviour. Don Cossacks bivouacked on the Champs-Élysées. Allied troops generally behaved well.
Good for them. I say good for them because that is not typically how a conquering army would treat a major city of an enemy that they've been fighting for a decade or so and finally have an opportunity. So it says a lot about command and control, says a lot about the nature of these men.
35 miles away, Napoleon was at Fontainebleau with 36,000 men, all of them hungry and exhausted after their 100-mile forced march. Nevertheless, Napoleon began planning an immediate advance on Paris.
Dude, you're done.
But for the first time, he faced unanimous opposition from his ministers and marshals, including Ney, MacDonald, Oudinot, and Berthier. They reminded him of his oath to act for the good of France. He accused them of disloyalty, acting only to save themselves. They told him the war was lost, and he must abdicate in favour of his son if possible. On the 4th of April, Marshal Marmont surrendered his entire corps to the coalition, which was marched over to the enemy lines against the wishes of many of its officers and men. This was a devastating blow to Napoleon, and encouraged the Allies to reject his offer of a conditional abdication in favor of his son. 2 days later, he abdicated without conditions. The Allied powers having proclaimed that the Emperor Napoleon is the only obstacle to the re-establishment of peace in Europe, the Emperor Napoleon, faithful to his oath, declares that he renounces for himself and his heirs the thrones of France and Italy, and that there is no personal sacrifice, including his life, that he is not ready to make in the interests of France. Napoleon's abdication was formalized by the Treaty of Fontainebleau, by which he was allowed to keep the title of emperor, become sovereign of the small island of Elba, and retain a bodyguard of 400 men. News came too late to prevent Wellington's attack on Toulouse, leading to a costly and pointless battle, with more than 7,000 casualties.
Interesting, because this is just a couple of months before the Battle of New Orleans. Not a couple months. The Battle of New Orleans is going to be just after the new year. But same thing happens. A treaty is signed ending the conflict in North America between the British and the Americans. And the Battle of New Orleans happens, which is America's big victory in the war. And you're going to have General Pakenham, who is leading the British troops, is going to be killed in this heavy defeat for the British after the war's already over. But word hasn't reached him yet.
The night after his abdication, Napoleon tried to commit suicide, using the poison that had been made for him in Russia in case of capture. But it had lost its potency, and he survived. 2 weeks later, Napoleon bade farewell to his old guard at Fontainebleau Palace, and began his journey into exile.
I've been wrong maybe in my plans. I have done harm in war, but it is all like a dream. So if you're somebody who's like, your life has been leading troops in combat and now you don't have that anymore, what do? That's probably why he tried to take his own life, because like that was all he knew.
The Napoleonic Wars, which had raged on land and sea for 11 years, seemed finally at an end. The death toll is unknown, but historians estimate that 2 to 3 million lives were lost across Europe. Most soldiers died not in battle, but from disease. Many thousands were left maimed and disfigured. For most of this period, Napoleon was master of Europe, imposing treaties on humbled enemies, redrawing frontiers, overthrowing old regimes, and making new kings. He was the last figure in history to combine total political power with frontline military genius, in the mold of Alexander and Caesar.
And honestly, unlike some of those, I think Napoleon did well at both. I mean, he was definitely a better general than a politician and a political, like a civilian leader. But he honestly, he didn't do a bad job with the latter. And obviously, may be the greatest of all time with the former.
But it seemed Napoleon's reign was to end in abject military defeat. However, exile on Elba did not prove to Napoleon's taste. In less than 10 months, he would return to France to fight one last great campaign to reclaim his throne.
Waterloo! All right, it's coming. That was great. I mean, the guy's a genius. And people ask me all the time, who do you think the greatest general of all time is? And I always respond the same way. Listen, you can't really ever say that for sure, because they're different eras and different situations, different circumstances. But any conversation about the greatest military leaders of all time has to begin with probably Napoleon, Julius Caesar, Alexander the Great, people like that. Napoleon has to be in that conversation, no doubt whatsoever. So let me know your thoughts. Use the comment section below. Please check out my video about the men who were shot at dawn during the Great War. Very proud of this series from Ypres that I've been doing. And usually it's the reaction videos that get all the views, but inevitably people who check out my original content for the first time say, man, I wish I had done that sooner. It's really good. So I'm not trying to brag about myself. I'm just trying to encourage you to check out some of that stuff as well. I'll throw up the link there on the screen. Thanks for watching.